9 a.m. on Monday. Okay, so I don't know, this may not be 30 minutes, which is fine. We can drink coffee. But I'm just going to present a little bit from one of those book projects, that's an old version. So it's now called Infrastructures of Belonging, Native Modernism and U.S. Cultures of Extraction. And there's not like a lot of like signposting in this little sort of like vignette from the beginning of the book, and so I'm just going to tell you like a couple things about it to start. One is that the book in general kind of develops a genealogy of U.S. cultures of colonialism by attending to the two convergences of the development of systems of extraction and politics of belonging. And then the second thing that the book does kind of in general sort of offer and also maybe problematize a rubric of what I'm calling native modernism to describe this like super extraordinary tradition of native writing and art in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Have you guys been to Minneapolis, St. Paul? Do you know about it? Okay. It's from like 1850 to the present. And that's kind of like, whatever, an interesting project. I mean, not like you think it's interesting. I think it's interesting in part because like the city, well, just because of like, especially with native writing, but also in general, our literary historical categories are kind of bound by this kind of binary of assimilation and sovereignty. And sovereignty, which is like attributed strictly to nations or nation states. Right, so the city is not like a sort of a normal rubric for understanding where native writing comes from or like where it means. So that's what that native modernism thing is doing. I'm not really interested in recovering the city as like a form for an explanatory form for native writing. It's not a cosmopolitanist project, but rather I'm kind of interested in the persistence of this tradition of art making as a kind of problem for literary history, and also as a kind of invitation both to refuse the sort of existing categories of literary history and also to imagine new ones. That imagination I'm calling infrapolitics. So I'm happy to talk about any of that bigger stuff later, including the history of sort of native Minneapolis, St. Paul, or the Twin Cities, as my editor would prefer me to say. Okay, and then this little vignette in particular does kind of two things. One is it introduces some of the main characters of the book. And then secondly, it demonstrates its primary methodology, which I call extraction history, which is a way of attending to the way that both artistic and jurisdictional forms are effects of extraction. How do we attend to that? And then also, how do we tell stories about art or about cities or about whatever in ways that don't reproduce kind of the array of sort of subject and object making that is normal to our study, but to my mind is also an effect of extraction. So that's what is happening there. Okay, so I'll just start. So we're looking at a piece by this guy named George Morrison, who I'm about to talk about. So in 1965, George Morrison started making landscapes out of driftwood. He gathered wood from Atlantic beaches near Provincetown, where he rented a studio on breaks from teaching at the Rhode Island School of Design. He looked for scraps of wood, frayed and weathered to the sea, but to the brink of abstraction. But that also bore some trace of human use or attachment. He said bits of paint half worn off, rust stains or color soaked in, the top of an old scrub brush, as some of these are. Morrison began each landscape, which he also called wood collages and paintings in wood, by fitting together a few pieces in the bottom left corner of the frame that, along broken lines of driftwood edges, gathered out into massive sweeps and rivulets of fragments that filled frames up to 14 feet wide and 5 feet tall, Setting off the top quadrant of each collage, a single twisted but unbroken line, a horizon line, is the only gesture spared from the turbulence and fracture and motion that characterizes these landscapes. Morrison was born in 1919 in a house near the shore of Lake Superior, a member of the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. I can tell you more about that sort of strange name later. He was sent to a boarding school in Wisconsin, attended and graduated from the Minneapolis School of Art, and moved to New York in 1944, where he made and showed work alongside Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Joan Mitchell, Robert Motherwell, Mark Rothko, and Franz Klein. During the years that he lived on the East Coast, Morrison was excluded from exhibitions of what was called Indian art that were kind of coming into fashion at that moment in the U.S. art market. And in fact, in 1948, the Philbrook Art Center, Tulsa, rejected his work, noting that it was not painted, quote, in the traditional manner of your forefathers. Even when the Philbrook eventually did accept Morrison's work in 1964, the curator wrote to Morrison and said that she was, quote, aware that Morrison was not an artist in the Indian style. Although this question of whether his work belongs in the category of Indian art did not preoccupy Morrison, it is one that continues to dominate criticism of his work today, which there's a lot of it, actually. One reason, perhaps, is that Morrison began making driftwood landscapes just as he decided to move back to Minnesota in 1970 to join the faculty of the United States' first American Indian Studies program at the University of Minnesota. A move, he wrote, that was inspired by a, quote, Indian connection and the need to insert Indian values into my work. His move to Minnesota, for which these driftwood landscapes became an avatar, is often interpreted as a pivot from an abstract period to a politically and ideologically situated one, a homecoming that structures a narrative of development in the life of a path-making native modernist. So what I'm about to read kind of traces the history of that vexed interpretation as a cultural history of extraction. And as such, it's also, what I'm trying to do here is kind of an experiment in how to narrate the entangled politics of art, indigeneity, land beyond the terms of colonial belonging. So when Morrison returned in 1970, Minneapolis-St. Paul also seemed to be remaking itself, a city whose political and economic life had always centered the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers. The milling industries those rivers powered was emptying itself into the suburbs. Strategically devalued Black, brown, and indigenous neighborhoods were obliterated by a new interstate system, as the manufacturing jobs on which those neighborhoods economically depended were replaced by the rise of a financial retail economy increasingly situated in the suburbs or into this financial district, which is pictured here. The Twin Cities transformation is a familiar story, of course, of urban crisis in the U.S., but one that hinged in more kind of immediately identifiable ways than it did in other U.S. cities on the unresolved contradiction of the social and jurisdictional form of the city that depends on the recurrent displacement and absorption of indigenous people and land relations. In the 1960s and 70s, the contradiction of displacement and absorption was most famously manifest in the rise of the American Indian movement. Like other urban anti-racist and decolonization movements, AIM demanded equal access to employment, healthcare, safety, and education. What distinguished AIM's insurgency from Alcatraz Island to the National Mall in Washington, D.C., was the way that they transformed occupation as a style of protest that stays with us today in a lot of ways, that denaturalized the settler city as a primary or coherent social or jurisdictional form. In one sense, the history of that denaturalization begins in Minneapolis-St. Paul, where AIM started as a cop watch system, a street patrol, 2 indigenous schools, which in a different form still exist today, and a local healthcare and legal support system before it became a national organization. Only a few months after Morrison arrived in Minnesota, AIM occupied the Naval Air Station in Minneapolis an unused facility associated with Fort Snelling, which is the original colonial installation in Minnesota on the river, situated exactly on a Dakota sacred site and adjacent to this island, which is renamed Pike Island, where in 1862, thousands of Dakota people were held in a concentration camp during the Dakota Uprising. Also, I can talk about that. Like the concurrent occupation of Alcatraz, the Naval Air Station occupation was premised on a common provision of U.S. treaties, which is still there in many treaties. In this case, the 1805 Treaty of St. Peter, that afforded for the return of unused federal land to indigenous people. AIM demanded that the Naval Air Station be redeveloped as an indigenous school, a demand that city and federal officials immediately rejected. However, the broader effect of AIM's occupation, like this one in Minneapolis-St. Paul, other cities was to demonstrate the spatial and historical incoherence of the jurisdictional form of the city itself, to indicate its internal and irreparable broken edges, and to insist that those edges, never the spaces of vacancy or pathology that the city may go out to be, were sites of abiding political motion. So as soon as Morrison arrives in the Twin Cities, he becomes an active member of AIM. At the same time, his driftwood landscapes, paradoxically, were embraced by the city's most powerful settler corporations and cultural institutions. I don't know what the next slide is. Here we go, that's good. So he sold driftwood collages to the Minneapolis Art Institute, General Mills, Honeywell, Prudential, all these evil companies. All companies, like specifically, whose wealth depended on the seizure of indigenous land and life. So he also had a solo show at the Walker Art Center, which is a really famous art gallery named after and funded by a lumber baron named T.H. Walker. He received a public art commission for a wood statue exhibited in a skyscraper named for the French explorer, a lot of French names ending with DeSalle or LaSalle, and a granite collage, this one, built in a pedestrian mall named for Jean Nicolet, the French explorer sometimes cited as discovering, heavy quotes, the Great Lakes. Misread Morrison's work and why they're interested in using that work to attach themselves to a narrative of the frontier past and the neoliberal future of U.S. colonialism gets to the heart of the questions at the heart of my book about how colonialism attempts and fails to control the meaning of art, how colonial political and aesthetic forms are produced by the management of belonging, and how we can clarify the always spatial, always ecological stakes, struggles around aesthetics and power, colonialism, and decolonization. So the moment characterized by both insurgent insertions of an urban indigenous space and by systematic divestment from the city's central black and indigenous neighborhoods, other corporations and institutions levered a particular and violently constrained notion of nativeness in Morrison's art to facilitate a transformation of the spatial and economic order of the city itself. So here, nativeness is not understood as kind of a radical counterclaim to the operation of U.S. colonialism, but rather a minority cultural aspect of it. I argue that, as such, colonial institutions misinterpreted Morrison's work and its relation to modern indigeneity by obscuring the aesthetic and political invention to which Morrison's work was actively committed. So the first landscape that Morrison sold after moving back to Minnesota is called Collage 9 Landscape. The piece is made of driftwood he brought from the Atlantic coast and others that he collected from alleys and backyards in his neighborhood in St. Paul. Like all collages, it's a study of material and social and historical motion. Morrison immersed himself in the process. He says the chance element of, this is still a quote, taking driftwood or discarded wood and playing one piece against the other. The patterns of color, shape, and texture that emerge are functions of Morrison's own manipulation and of the possibility or limits of attachment manifest in each piece. Those patterns are ornate, massive. This is like 15 feet long. And mutating, they express within the piece's huge frame a multidimensionality of motion beyond the vertical and horizontal, a coruscation of density, gesture, and reference. The complexity of this effect was intentional and has to do with how the wood pieces in pattern express a present of exposition and also, like a shoreline, gather the residue of moving histories of growth and harvest, commodification, shipment, and use, and disposal that mingle below and beyond that present. For Morrison, those histories were consistently environmental and social, and they generate an animating tension that never resolves into familiar postures of presence or absence, location or loss. So collage, which is what we call this, for Morrison is both a response to the formal operation of colonial extraction and a practice of ecological invention. In a formal sense, Morrison's interest in collage is plainly unrecuperative. The pieces of driftwood he used are not joined to represent or restore what of them was lost to extraction. And in this sense, collage does not refer to a total effect of fragments rearranged into pattern. In Morrison's work, collage is better understood as attention to the formal and effective generativity of wood worn in odd angles and unnatural likeness, and in subtly incurvate and arching sanded surfaces to extracted remains. It's a practice that collects both wood arrayed in fluid pattern and the interstitial spaces which you can see preserved between each piece, and thereby creates a formal tension between what of each driftwood piece is and is not possible to connect. Morrison remembered the history that preceded the wood's inclusion in the collage. He says, there was an interesting history of these pieces, who had touched them, where they had come from, and also its eventual decay. He said, the wood won't last forever, I know that. Thus, we can read the gaps between driftwood pieces not as spaces of loss, but of organic exchange, where within the collage the pieces literally gather and decay into each other. If, for Morrison, collage is a way of gathering with and among the absent, the other primary formal framework of the piece, landscape, is rethinking the sociality of setting. The term landscape is one that Morrison hesitated around or qualified whenever he talked about the collages. He said, I think a respectful, knowledgeable person would know that they're paintings in wood. Pause. Landscapes. Later he said, I imagine that people see the wood first. They don't look at it as a landscape painting, though it's subtitled landscape. They may not even see the horizon line at first, which is here. The initial appeal comes from the wood itself and the tactile surface. In a colonial context, as W.J.T. Mitchell notes, landscape is a medium and a making, an enclosure fantasy. Landscape is the imagination of space, primally unclaimed, but through whose mixing of proximity and spaciousness property is remade as an effect of scene, imperialism. In Morrison's collage, these dynamics are referenced and actively thwarted. Morrison's landscape is also a medium and is also concerned with how art participates in the politics of space. But whereas imperial landscape derives a rhetoric of control out of the construction of spatial ideality, what Mitchell calls the antithesis of land, Morrison's landscape problematizes interpretive control by revealing the generative indistinction between space and land. As he points out, the experiences of observing the collage is one that frustrates acquisitive choreography of the spectacle. He says they don't look at it as a landscape. Rather, the force of the collage is effective. It draws the reader to it, to touch it. An appeal, Morrison points out, that comes from the wood itself. The effect then is not an abstraction of or from an idea of land, but a feeling of being overcome by the materiality of land, even in the moment of observing the collage in the gallery. And that's certainly been my experience of witnessing these pieces in person. They sort of like change what it means to stand in front of them. Yeah.
Just, do these pieces have any relief, or is this surface of the work
They're like 4 inches.
So there's some
deep.
There's some, but
Oh,
there's,
you mean between the pieces?
yeah,
Yeah, but it's like centimeters.
okay, so it's pretty,
It's, I mean, but if you like look at it, if I were looking at it IRL from this angle,
uh-huh,
I mean, it would have looked flat,
okay,
but it's like subtle.
okay.
And it's more like, I don't know, that's like a really interesting question because it's like, it's not like about like skyscrapery
Sure.
things like that. It's more like you wonder if you're looking at it from this angle, like what would happen if you poured water over it? Because it would just like do something weird. That's a good
Sorry.
question. No, I would like that one. Okay. So Morrison's landscape, in that sense, makes land as opposed to being an antithesis. It makes land, and as such resets the terms of its encounter beyond interpretation, closer perhaps to something like relation. So the MIA purchased this piece in 1975. The same year completed a massive $30 million expansion to its main building, designed by the renowned Japanese architect Kenzo Tange, who became famous for designing the memorial at Hiroshima, I think. The addition was intended to modernize and expand the museum's founding democratic concept. It's a public museum. An exhibition space free to everyone, joined to an art school and to a theater. As a part of that expansion, the museum also updated its curatorial scheme. This is really wild. Adding the department first called Primitive Art, and before it was later renamed Art of Africa and the Americas. Like, what a category. In which this piece was situated, or exhibited. The MIA is situated in a neighborhood that became the vibrant center of, and still is a vibrant center of Native life and organizing in Minneapolis in the aftermath of post-war white disinvestment. Originally, it was land seized from Dakota people. This is the museum site, basically, in the mid-19th century by a settler named John Blaisdell. Blaisdell sold the lumber and eventually some of the land itself to this dude, Douglas Morrison, no relation, a man who started the city's first industrial sawmill and eventually became the city's first mayor. Douglas Morrison made a fortune milling lumber harvested from all over the state, including from thousands of acres of pine forest he bought himself, land that had been acquired through a treaty with the Ojibwe leaders in 1837, whose terms, for instance, the provision that Ojibwe people could hunt and fish in perpetuity, were never upheld by the U.S. In 1911, Douglas Morrison's son, Clinton, donated the land the family bought from Blaisdell to the city of Minneapolis for the construction of a museum whose founding principle, characteristic of early 20th century progressivism, in the words of its first director, Joseph Breck, was to liberate the museum from the model of the storehouse of prison arts and to extend no less a cordial welcome to the humbler amateurs than to the carriage folk. Like other corporations and institutions that acquired Morrison's collage landscapes in the 1970s, the MIA is an effect and a technology of extraction. Here, throughout my book, extraction is a cultural and ecological concept. It signals both how forms of colonial belonging proliferate around indigenous land dispossession, and also how those forms remake themselves through the management and ecological meaning. Thinking about the MIA, I think I have another slide. Yeah, this is like kind of an interesting curation of Morrison's work. Thinking about the MIA through the lens of extraction is less about singling out this particular institution or even the institutional form of a museum than it is about showing how colonial cultural forms in general that organize the politics of belonging function as thresholds for the constant transformation of land, capital, and power on which the broader operation of U.S. colonialism depends. For instance, the museum's self-concept as a public institution is only possible through a recurrence of indigenous alienation of the land under the museum, of the trees and water through which Douglas Morrison made a fortune, of the civic investment that the city directed to a colonial museum in a native neighborhood instead of the indigenous school that AIM asked to be installed in the abandoned Naval Air Station. And each such recurrence elaborates its publicness in a particular way, as a derivative of what Glenn Coulthard calls, are you reading that?
Yeah. No, I read it.
We should all teach it,
Okay.
Glenn Coulthard calls persistent colonial accumulation as a primal symbol of colonial occupation, what Gene O'Brien, in an amazing book everyone should read called First Name, Last Name, called First Name, as a threshold from or into which indigenous life can be categorically excluded or assimilated. Thus, the museum, like other colonial institutions, transforms multiple spatial, economic, and political operations of extraction into a differentiated experience of access. For those it reproduces as subjects of extraction, it makes access to land, to the public, to the knowledge of what is excluded from the public, that is indigeneity, available and ideologically defining. For the people and ecological relations it reproduces as objects of extraction, it makes being available to access ontologically defining. The MIA's acquisition of collage 9 landscape helped define Morrison as a native modernist for the art world and for Minneapolis-St. Paul, in part by exhibiting the piece in the primitive art and then art of Africa and the Americas department. By curating the work in this way, the MIA used Morrison to institutionalize a relationship between modernity and indigeneity that erases the specificity of native claims to land. In the shift from primitive to art of Africa and the Americas, the MIA replaced a violent temporalizing, that is anachronizing, universalization of indigeneity with a spatially global one. And I should say that they were doing like a celebration of Morrison's work, and like as part of the celebration, one of the gestures that they made was that they like ceremonially brought out one of the landscapes from the Art of Africa and Americas section into the contemporary art section. This is a tactic that Joanne Barker terms the racialization of the Indian, in which she says the notion that indigenous peoples are members of sovereign political collectivities is made incomprehensible by collapsing indigenous people into minority groups that make up a rainbow of multicultural difference. A tribal community whose expropriated land was the economic precondition for the museum, which was also built on Dakota land, is transformed by a curatorial gesture that locates the museum in a global landscape of difference rather than evince the political contradictions of its spatial and temporal location. For Barker, who's an indigenous legal theorist, indigenous theorist, racialization means replacing the treaty relationship between tribes and other nations with a political minority status, theorized in the Marshall Trilogy as a condition of wardship, which actually has a lot to do with the Treaty of Hopewell, which is on Clemson's campus. As she and other Native Studies scholars have pointed out, the erasure is not singular but recurrent. It recurs whenever colonial structures are thrown into crisis, expand, or remake themselves, what Patrick Wolf defines as the structure, not the event, except for colonialism. Barker's use of racialization in this context is comparative, in which indigeneity is stripped of its sovereign claim to land, seems to make it comparable to positions of minority status, a political minority already naturalized within the U.S. Racial capitalism is landless and non-sovereign. However, the way that colonial institutions use Morrison's collages at this particular moment of urban transformation invites an elaboration of Barker's theory of racialization to understand how the colonial construction of modern indigeneity as landless also served the intrinsically anti-Black discourse of civic revitalization. So in the aftermath of suburbanization, civic and business leaders invested in sites like the MIA and this, which is Nicollet Mall, as spaces to return public interest to downtown. Remember, Nicollet was the one who discovered the Great Lakes. In such spaces, Morrison's collages collage landscapes, works whose aesthetic interest in fragment and pattern were misconstrued as thematizing political unity from individual difference, were exhibited as avatars of the new urban multicultural life which Minneapolis is investing in living every day more intensely. And here I'm interested in how discourse in public life, Morrison's collages were used to ornament, operated both metaphorically and literally on the level of biology and ecology in the city. As in other gentrifying cities, Minneapolis-St. Paul officials relied heavily on metaphors of health, lifeblood, vitality, growth, and damage, blight, disease, decay, to advertise and fundraise for investments like the MIA expansion and the Nicollet Mall renovation, which is now in its second iteration as we speak. And as in other cities, that rhetoric was deployed on behalf of a revitalization that produced new forms and distributions of environmental violence outside the revaluing urban spaces. I can talk more about that too. Because the expressed interest in the new urban spaces was economic, revitalization in the Twin Cities depended on a classic neoliberal model of financing and governance, remaking retail and cultural spaces to bring life back to the street, depending on tax incentives and regulatory easements that concentrated profit around a few corporations, predictably distributed environmental vulnerability to poor and rural communities around the state and city. Today, the catastrophic toxification of the state's soil and water as a result of manufacturing, mining, and toxic dumping projects by companies like 3M and Honeywell, who are also like some of the biggest weapons manufacturers in the country, who directly invested in and benefited from the city's revitalization are only beginning to be understood. Within the cities themselves, the ecological logic of urban revitalization is also dependent on what Sylvia Winter calls the disselection of Black life as the governing concept of public life. That disselection was literalized when federal, state, and city officials routed a new interstate system connecting Minneapolis and St. Paul, which is called I-94. I mean, I-94 is elsewhere, but it connects the cities through the Rondo neighborhood, which is pictured here, the largest and most cherished Black neighborhood in St. Paul. The destruction of 650 Black homes and over 100 Black-owned businesses in the name of heightened cultural and economic exchange between the cities concretized the necropolitical logic of the city's public life. That's the city. That's the same spot. In the aftermath of the police murder of Fernando Castile in 2016, anti-racist protesters trenchantly marks the legacy of this concept of public life by stopping traffic on I-94 exactly at the site where the Rondo neighborhood once stood. So this piece of my book has kind of been an attempt to think about a given work of art, collage and landscape, in the city together. And this attempt to kind of track the ways that they're connected by genealogies of life and space and motion. At the same time, here and throughout the book, I want to avoid repeating the ways that those two things, art and the city, have been reduced to or remade within the colonial practices of interpretation, valuation, and recovery. The way the meaning of Morrison's life, his work, the Ojibwe and Dakota people in Minnesota and Minneapolis, St. Paul in particular, have been managed through a cultural economy of extraction. In this sense, to think about is primarily an incitement to writing differently. How do we think and we write about, which is to say around or among forms linked by moving histories of colonialism and decolonization, seizure and endurance, domination and repair. In sort of the rest of this beginning part of the book, I tend to think about how cultural histories of gathering and extraction have produced the shifting form of the city, whose interpretation demands that we think with what the form itself absents. And using methods and names of Morrison's collage, so I want to use the work systemic and political practice. I also attempt to think about the trajectories of indigenous social and aesthetic invention as sustaining practices that exceed the terms of extraction and belonging. So, thanks for listening. Well, it's the names are funny, but the way people talk about Ojibwe people now is, they say Anishinaabe. Ojibwe is like a word. There's one word that Ojibwe people use to talk about themselves, and the word Chippewa is like a colonial distortion of that. So you can hear it like Ojibwe, Ojibwe, Chippewa, Chippewa, Chippewa. So it's just a colonial distortion of the word Ojibwe. But when the tribes consolidated in the aftermath of allotment, they kind of like made these tribal clusters, and some of them carried on the name Chippewa. But Ojibwe people talk about themselves as being Ojibwe or Anishinaabe.
Thank you so much. That's really great. Really excited to talk to you more about the project outside.
I'm excited to talk to you too.
Well, okay. Okay, can you guys just listen?
What do you mean?
One thing, and this may just be my personal thing coming out of the period that I work in, which is earlier than this. But when I think about extraction economies, I tend to think about particular forms of particular dynamics of gender and sexuality that are generally not based around a sort of part of the traditional domestic structure, but often involve colonies of men and sex workers as a sort of prevailing dynamic, rather than whatever sex work happening in the context of traditional nuclear family.
Yeah.
So, I guess, can you say something about sex? I guess.
Sure. I love talking about sex on Monday at like 9:30.
Who doesn't?
Strangers. No, you're not strangers anymore. Yes. I have a whole chapter about that. And what I try to do in the chapter is, have you guys read Louise Gerger? All of them. Four Souls. That's one of them. So I like think of, she's really famous now because she won the National Book Award, and she's like the first Indigenous novelist to win the National Book Award for a novel called Roundhouse, which you should read today. Like you should skip the rest of this event and the rest of what you're doing today and read the Roundhouse, which is about the sort of, it sort of trigger warning and content warning. It's about how it is the case that it's essentially the sexual assault of Indigenous women and gender nonconforming people is essentially legal. It is literally legal within the current system. And the Violence Against Women Act is almost nothing to protect them. But actually the sort of entanglement of gender or sex and extraction is perceived as earlier in her work in Four Souls, which is a great one to have read, and Tracks, which are all about the precise thing that you said, which is like the problem of the framework of domestic, which is both something that can be used to conceptualize or understand like extraction via sex or sexual assault, and also is also the framework that legally is used to understand the relationship between tribes in the U.S. So Marshall, trying to make sense of this Treaty of Hopewell, actually described indigenous nations in the U.S. as domestic dependent nations, which is basically, I mean, it's a meaningless legal, it like has no precedent in like all legal language, and nobody even knows what it means like to this day. But basically what it does is like establish a relationship of extraction. And actually, I mean, I can kind of go on and on about this. Specifically, what's extracted through that formulation is kind of like different formations of interiority, but that doesn't matter. The point is that the domestic in Marshall's formulation is used as a way of extracting, as setting up a permanent extractive relationship between the U.S. and indigenous communities. And one of the ways that that's manifest is actually like literally through the recurrence of violence against indigenous women as a fundamental methodology through which the U.S. reproduces itself and transforms. And so, I mean, the current incarnation of that is these pipelines, right? Which become, and there's like a Enbridge pipeline is being built across Minnesota, like as we speak. There's going to be much protest, but like those pipelines, as you know, like become spaces for like the most like brutal concentration of gender violence against indigenous women. In Canada, there's been sort of more organized around this. So I don't know, Jacob, I didn't really answer the question, but that's all to say is like the domestic is an interesting way of thinking about how that relationship between extraction and sex and gender violence exists.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously the domestic is no picnic, and that would actually be usually ground. I mean, but it is in the content. This is, I've never quite been able to figure out what to do with this, but there was a fishing camp in New Hampshire in the 1640s that was on an island, and women were prohibited from the island on the grounds that there would be no reason for them to be there except prostitution. So,
does white women work?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. I mean, I'm not sure.
I mean, that's the point. It's just like the category of domestic as any kind of enclosed or separated space, even for the violent sort of like gender binaries that we are talking about in that case, or that like organizes white American literature, isn't even available to indigenous tribal systems or families.
I have a question about the terms extraction and ecological inclusion. And I'm wondering if extraction is always kind of tied to this exploitation and commodification, and if ecological inclusion is kind of been counter to that, is more intentional ways of taking from Earth, and it's more thoughtful. If you could just speak to those terms.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like, that's. I mean, like, I don't even know what to except to just say that, like, that's basically the tension in what I see like, more simply. Like, all those pieces are pieces of wood are not like from trees, they're like from 2x4s and stuff, right? So they're like used in industrial sites, they're used as building materials, they're used, probably not, by like indigenous people. And then that's into like artifacts of extraction. Which isn't to say that like they're bad or evil or something, it's just that it's just like why they're shaped that way. Everything about them can be like understood through the rubric of extraction. It's cultural sort of then, yeah, so like what I'm, just the way that I'm trying to think about this, not just as like a painting or something, but like actually as like more so like making land out of wood or something is what I'm trying to talk about as ecological invention and try to insist that like this is land, like that piece is land, and that when it's in a gallery, like it not only like thwarts the particular extractive histories of the pieces in general, but it also it thwarts the extractive frameworks like primitive art or whatever into which it's put. Like actually like makes a different kind of relationality, like animates a different kind of relationality that isn't local or situated in the piece itself, but it changes everything about it or that's around it. That's kind of what I mean, but like I don't know, like if you have other thoughts about that.
I mean, I was just, I guess the limited term extraction in itself, I'm not that familiar with, and I've heard it kind of circulating.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in, I haven't read your whole text in which it's, or the text that came out of it, and then I was really interested in your kind of statement that you're reading this, not this art, not just as an object, but as a theory, and
Yeah.
thinking through what it means to kind of collect the pieces and to think about the way that they are together apart and the way they decay over time and kind of what that means, and then even the kind of exploitation of this as extraction by the city to
Yeah.
kind of afford these new development projects.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, extraction is becoming like a kind of like a buzzy term, which is kind of a bummer. Although like it means I should like finish my book stat. But and somebody else will do like a really smart and like historically honest and responsible like genealogy of the term. But like I don't understand science or like even industry, and so for me like for me extraction links to a genealogy of sort of Black, Indigenous, and anti-colonial thought, which is about how are the categories of subject and object made? Like how does when is a resource? How do you make something a resource? Like that's the process that I'm calling extraction, and so there's a lot of different ways that you could actually talk about that. I mean,
Yeah, I was even thinking about it in context. Well, you started like talking about how these virtual boarding schools.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, Shaw also, and how she was taken to the boarding schools and kind of stripped from her culture, but also the culture was used
yes.
as leverage or as like a cultural icon.
Yeah, I mean, boarding schools were like an origin point for cultural appropriation now, and also like the schools took Indigenous children and like made them workers. So, like they objectified them or modified them in like a whole other way too. So there's like an array of systematics of objectification that occur.
And it's like an erasure of identity, like using elements to make them modified.
Yes.
This is a boring question, but I can't help but think, especially when you're just talking now about the idea of the expectation of the city of art and ACU in terms of extraction within this art. So what happens to this art when he sells it to these spaces? And he himself is going to be very wealthy off of this.
I mean, like the good news is, I guess he never really became wealthy. Like I think he sold this one for $4,000 something, which is like really wild. I mean, it's like the size of that dark teal square or whatever. I mean, now it would be $15 million. But like he also like gave half the stuff away to paint. But it doesn't. I mean, none of that even matters. It's just like. I mean, it's basically you're pointing to like a really important contradiction that I would say is not his problem to solve.
Yeah.
It's like a third world problem to solve. And now this stuff is like super famous, is everywhere. I mean, the National Museum of the American Indian, which I worked at when it opened, like the very first exhibition that they did was Morrison. So like literally institutions recreate themselves around Morrison's work, and it continues to be. And so it's like in terms of money, like that's the question that I would ask. Is like, who people who are getting rich out of Morrison, like aren't Morrison or his son, unfortunately.
I just
He's
keep
okay.
picturing that Marvel
Oh,
study show,
yeah.
and I just keep picturing like high heels and loafers.
No, exactly. Yeah, and you can have that experience if you want to. They just moved it from one place to another. They moved it in front of the public library in order to like mark the library as versus.
It's talked about like that. It's really not as collage line. And it's really not driftwood. It's found wood repurposed or just, there's nail holes in it. It was structural. But is any of it really driftwood found on like?
Yeah, like I mean, Morrison was like such a weirdo. It was amazing. He had like his whole family and all of his friends always collecting driftwood. So when he was in the Atlantic, when he was in Rhode Island, they would walk on the beach and they would look for places. And then he would walk along Lake Superior and collect things. And he would have people from all over the world send him driftwood all the time that he would include. So none of it's local to any particular shoreline. And some of it is from like alleys and stuff like that. That's also driftwood. I mean, especially in a city on a river, like it's totally driftwood. In that sense, drifting is a
Yeah, I like the play of words is actually there in physical pieces.
right. He literally like drove when he moved back to Minnesota in 1970. He like had like 2 gigantic boxes of wood that he drove from Rhode Island to Minnesota. Stuff. Artists. It's a good album.
We still have about 5 minutes, but we didn't go ahead
I think it could be coffee time. That's one thing.
How do you spell Louis Gerber's last name for everybody?
ERRSH.
And we're all going to read the Brown House today.
Yeah, read your own house today, and then
Except for